I was 3 months pregnant with a secret I couldn't tell anyone when my ex-boyfriend Marcus decided to destroy me in front of his new girlfriend at my favorite cafe, the same place where he proposed to her instead of me 6 months ago. And as I sat there with my hand protectively curved over the small bump hidden beneath my oversized cashmere sweater, watching him parade Skylar around like she was some kind of trophy he'd won in a competition I didn't even know I was entered in, I realized that some men are only capable of love when it makes them look good. And Marcus had always been more concerned with appearances than with anything real. Café Luminaire had been my sanctuary long before Marcus ever knew it existed. Back when I was still working those brutal double shifts at the hospital and needed a quiet place to decompress with overpriced lavender lattes and the kind of atmosphere that made you feel like maybe your life wasn't falling apart even when it absolutely was. And now, here I was again, 3 months after the night that changed everything, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the familiar leather booth by the window, while my entire world shifted beneath me in ways that would have terrified me if I'd let myself think about it for more than 30 seconds at a time. The autumn sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in that golden hour glow that photographers kill for, making even the scattered pastry crumbs on the marble tables look artistic and intentional. And I was attempting to lose myself in the Architectural Digest magazine I'd grabbed from the rack by the door when I heard that laugh. Skylar's high-pitched, performative giggle that sounded like wind chimes being strangled. And my stomach dropped even before I looked up to see them walking through the entrance like they owned the place. Like the entire world was just a stage set designed specifically for their happiness. Marcus looked exactly the same as he had 6 months ago when I'd caught him in our bed with his just a friend from work, still wearing those expensive suits that his father's money bought him, still sporting that perfectly styled hair that he spent more time on than I ever spent on mine, still carrying himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having experienced real consequence in your entire privileged life, and seeing him now with Skylar attached to his arm like a designer handbag made something acidic and bitter rise in my throat that had nothing to do with the morning sickness I'd finally stopped experiencing 2 weeks ago. Skylar was everything I wasn't. Blonde where I was dark. Petite where I was curvy even before the pregnancy. Bubbly and effervescent where I tended toward quiet intensity. And I knew without a doubt that Marcus had chosen her specifically because she was my opposite. Because men like him need to prove something to themselves when a relationship ends. Need to demonstrate that they've upgraded rather than simply moved on. And the enormous diamond on her left hand caught the light as she gestured animatedly about something, throwing rainbow prisms across the cafe walls that felt like tiny daggers aimed directly at whatever was left of my pride. I should have left the moment I saw them. Should have gathered my things and slipped out the back entrance that led to the alley where the delivery trucks unloaded supplies every morning. But something kept me frozen in that booth. Some stubborn part of me that refused to run, that insisted I had every right to be here in my sanctuary, even if it meant enduring their presence. And so I stayed, keeping my eyes fixed on the magazine in front of me, not actually reading a single word about Mediterranean villa renovations, but pretending with everything I had that I was completely absorbed and utterly unaware of their existence. But Marcus had always had a talent for finding me even when I didn't want to be found. Had always possessed this uncanny ability to sense when I was trying to avoid him. And I felt his presence approaching before I heard his voice. Felt the way the air seemed to shift and curdle around him. And when he spoke, his words cut through the ambient cafe noise like a knife through silk, sharp and deliberately aimed to wound. "Jesus, Viv. You really let yourself go," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that men use when they want to insult you while maintaining plausible deniability. And I looked up from my magazine to find him standing beside my booth, with Skylar practically glued to his side, her blue eyes wide with what I suspected was rehearsed sympathy. And the smile on his face was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that speaks of satisfaction rather than joy. "What happened? You got fat?" The words landed like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to hit where it would hurt most, and I felt my face flush hot, with humiliation while my hand instinctively tightened over my stomach, over the secret I carried that I couldn't defend myself with, over the tiny life growing inside me that belonged to a man so dangerous that even speaking his name in certain parts of the city could get you killed. And the irony of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so absolutely devastating. Skylar giggled behind her perfectly manicured hand, the sound grating against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. And I saw the way she leaned into Marcus, seeking his approval, feeding off his cruelty like it was some kind of shared joke between them. And I wondered if she knew that this was how it would eventually go for her too, that men who enjoy humiliating their exes will eventually find reasons to humiliate their current partners. That cruelty is a habit rather than a one-time performance. "I've been busy," I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted it to, lacking the sharp edge I'd been cultivating since our breakup. And I hated myself for not having something better prepared, some cutting remark that would put him in his place and wipe that smug expression off his face. But my mind was racing with calculations about how obvious my pregnancy was becoming, whether he could see it, whether anyone could see it, and the fear overrode everything else. Marcus leaned against the edge of my booth, invading my space in that casually aggressive way he'd always had, acting like he owned every room he walked into, and everyone in it owed him their attention. And his eyes raked over me with an assessment that felt like being evaluated by a used car salesman, cold and transactional, and utterly without affection or even basic human decency. "Busy eating, apparently," he continued, and Skylar's giggle intensified, her hand now covering her mouth entirely as if she was trying and failing to contain her amusement at my expense, and I realized with crystalline clarity that this entire interaction was a performance that Marcus had seen me sitting here and decided to make me into entertainment for his new girlfriend. Proof of how much better his life was now that I wasn't in it. I mean, I know breakups are hard and all, but there's no need to eat your feelings, Viv. There are healthier coping mechanisms, you know? The urge to tell him the truth rose in my throat like bile, the desire to watch his face drain of color when he realized that I wasn't just gaining weight from emotional eating but was actually carrying a child, that I'd moved on so completely that I was building a future with someone else, that his opinion of my body and my choices mattered exactly as much as dust on the wind. But I swallowed the words back down, because telling Marcus anything was dangerous. Because the father of this child wasn't just someone else, but was Dante Salvatore. And that was a name you didn't speak casually. A connection you didn't advertise unless you wanted to paint a target on your back. 3 months ago, I'd been a completely different person, still reeling from catching Marcus in our bed, still believing that heartbreak was the worst thing that could happen to you, still naive enough to think that going to that charity gala alone would be some kind of empowering statement about my independence and resilience, and I'd worn my best black dress, the one that hugged every curve and made me feel like maybe I was worth something, even if Marcus had decided I wasn't. And I'd walked into that ballroom full of the city's elite with my head held high, and my heart held together with tape and wishful thinking. I remembered the moment I first saw Dante Salvatore across that crowded space, the way he'd been standing near the bar with an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the proceedings with the kind of detached interest that suggested he was simultaneously part of the event and entirely above it. And when our eyes met across the distance, I'd felt something shift in my chest, some recognition of danger and desire tangled up together in a way that should have sent me running, but instead drew me closer like a moth to a flame that would definitely, absolutely burn me alive. He'd approached with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd never needed to ask for anything, because people simply gave him what he wanted out of a combination of fear and fascination. And when he'd introduced himself with just his first name, as if the last name wasn't necessary, as if everyone already knew exactly who he was, I'd been 3 glasses of champagne deep and reckless enough to pretend I didn't know what getting involved with a man like him would mean, reckless enough to let him lead me out of that gala, and into the back of his car, and eventually into his penthouse suite where he'd touched me like I was something precious and rare even while his hands held the kind of controlled violence that spoke of a life I couldn't begin to understand. One night of passion that was supposed to be forgetting Marcus, supposed to be reclaiming my body and my choices and my sense of self-worth, and instead it had become the moment that divided my life into before and after, the moment that created this secret growing inside me that I couldn't share with anyone, not my friends who would panic about the danger, not my family who would ask too many questions I couldn't answer, and certainly not Marcus, who was currently standing over me with all the sensitivity of a jackhammer, completely oblivious to the fact that he was mocking a pregnant woman. "You should really try that new gym that opened up on 5th, Skylar chimed in, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my teeth ache. And I could see the diamond on her finger catching the light again. Could see the way she angled her hand just so to make sure I noticed it, to make sure I understood that she'd won something I'd apparently been competing for. They have these amazing prenatal yoga classes. Oh wait, I mean regular yoga classes, sorry. I don't know why I said prenatal." The word hit me like a bucket of ice water, and for one horrible moment I thought she knew. Thought somehow my secret was written across my face in letters large enough for everyone to read. But then I saw the malice in her eyes and realized it was just another jab. Another attempt to imply that I looked pregnant when I was just fat. And the cruelty of it took my breath away even as I recognized it for the mindless meanness it was. The kind of casual violence that people who'd never really suffered inflicted on others for sport. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice finally finding some of its strength, some of the steel that had been building in me over these past 3 months as I'd navigated the impossible situation I'd found myself in. And I started gathering my things. The magazine I hadn't read, the half-finished latte that had gone cold, the oversized purse that now held prenatal vitamins and a growing list of things I needed to figure out before this child arrived. But Marcus wasn't finished with his performance yet. "Oh, come on, Viv. Don't be so sensitive," he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice, the pleasure he was taking in my discomfort. And it struck me that I'd wasted 2 years of my life with someone who was fundamentally incapable of kindness, someone who measured his own worth by how effectively he could diminish others. "I'm just concerned about you, that's all. You look like you've been having a rough time, and I feel partially responsible, you know. Maybe if I'd been a better boyfriend, you wouldn't be stress-eating yourself into a whole new dress size." The sheer audacity of it, the way he was somehow making himself both the villain and the concerned ex-boyfriend, the way he was performing empathy while actually twisting the knife deeper, made something inside me finally snap, and I stood up from the booth with enough force that my chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of other cafe patrons who'd probably been pretending not to listen to this entire mortifying exchange. And I looked Marcus directly in his self-satisfied face with all the dignity I could muster. "Go to hell, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low and controlled, even though I wanted to scream, wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of him and his cruel games and his pathetic need to make himself feel big by making others feel small. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Wouldn't give Skylar another story to tell about the crazy ex-girlfriend who couldn't handle seeing them happy together. I pushed past them toward the exit, my vision blurring with tears that I absolutely refused to let fall until I was safely away from their mocking eyes. And the autumn air hit my face like a slap when I burst through the cafe doors onto the sidewalk, the sudden temperature change making me gasp. And I stood there for a moment, trying to remember how to breathe normally, trying to calm the racing of my heart that couldn't be good for the baby, trying to figure out how I was going to survive in this city where running into Marcus was apparently inevitable, and humiliating myself in public had become my new normal. That's when I noticed the sleek black Mercedes idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the cafe's storefront back at me, and I felt my stomach drop for an entirely different reason than Marcus's cruelty. Because I recognized that car, had seen it before outside my apartment building and near the hospital where I worked, and in places where its presence couldn't possibly be coincidental. And as if on cue, the rear passenger door opened smoothly, and a man in an immaculate suit stepped out with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested this wasn't a random encounter but rather something that had been planned and orchestrated and inevitable. "Ms. Moretti?" Luca Marchetti said, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as someone who'd grown up in the old neighborhood, someone who'd risen through ranks I didn't want to think too hard about. And his dark eyes held a mixture of respect and something that might have been sympathy as he gestured toward the open car door. Mr. Salvatore requests your presence. He's been watching, and he's seen enough. The drive to Dante Salvatore's estate passed in a blur of tree-lined streets and progressively more expensive neighborhoods, each turn taking us further from the modest part of the city where I'd built my normal, ordinary life, and deeper into the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew it was there. And I sat in the back of that Mercedes with my hands folded protectively over my stomach, while Luca drove in silence, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror to check on me with an expression that suggested he'd been given very specific instructions about my care and comfort, which somehow made the entire situation feel more surreal, rather than less. I'd known, somewhere in the rational part of my brain, that had been systematically shutting down ever since I'd peed on that pregnancy test and watched 2 pink lines appear like a verdict I couldn't appeal, that Dante wouldn't simply disappear from my life after our night together, that men like him didn't operate according to the normal rules of casual encounters and mutual ghosting. But I'd convinced myself that his silence over the past 3 months meant he'd moved on, that I'd been just another temporary distraction in a life full of more important concerns, and the discovery that he'd actually been having me watched this entire time sent a complicated mixture of fear and something dangerously close to relief flooding through my system. The gates to the Salvatore estate opened automatically as we approached, massive wrought iron constructions that probably cost more than my annual salary and depicted some kind of elaborate family crest that spoke of old money and older power, and the driveway beyond them curved through gardens that had been designed by someone who understood that true wealth was displayed through restraint rather than ostentation, through the kind of carefully cultivated beauty that looked effortless but required constant, invisible maintenance. And I found myself pressing closer to the window like a child at a museum, trying to take in every detail of this world I'd stumbled into, without meaning to, without understanding the full implications of what one reckless night would create. The house itself, though calling it a house felt like calling the ocean a puddle, rose before us in stone and glass and architectural ambition, managing to be both classical and modern in a way that suggested someone had spent a fortune making sure every element was perfect. And as Luca brought the car to a smooth stop in front of the main entrance where stairs swept up to doors that looked like they belonged on a cathedral, I realized with startling clarity that this was the world my child would be born into, that the tiny being growing inside me was heir to all of this wealth and power and danger, and the responsibility of that knowledge settled over me like a weight I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry. "Mr. Salvatore is in his study," Luca said as he opened my door with the kind of practiced courtesy that spoke of years of service, and he offered his hand to help me out of the car, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the gun I could see outlined beneath his jacket. And I took it because my legs felt unsteady, and my head was spinning with the rapid progression from cafe humiliation to Mafia estate. And I needed something solid to hold on to, even if that something was a man who probably killed people for a living. "He's asked that I bring you directly to him if you're comfortable with that, Ms. Moretti." The fact that he was asking, that he was giving me the illusion of choice even though we both knew I was going to see Dante whether I wanted to or not, was a small kindness that I appreciated more than I probably should have. And I nodded because speaking felt beyond me at the moment, because I was too busy trying to prepare myself for seeing the father of my child again, for confronting the man whose face I'd been trying not to think about every time I felt the baby move, every time I had to make a decision about this pregnancy that affected both of us but that I'd been making alone because I'd been too afraid of this exact moment, too terrified of what it would mean to bring Dante Salvatore into my life in a permanent, irrevocable way. Luca led me through halls that felt more like an art gallery than a home, past paintings that I suspected were originals rather than reproductions, past furniture that had probably been in the Salvatore family for generations, past windows that offered views of grounds so extensive I couldn't see where they ended, and with every step I felt more out of place, more acutely aware that I was a nurse from a working-class neighborhood who'd gone to state school on scholarships and still had student loans, walking through a world where people probably had servants to manage their servants, where the coffee table in the hallway I was passing likely cost more than my car. The study doors were already open when we reached them, as if Dante had been watching our approach, as if he'd timed everything precisely so that I would walk in to find him exactly as he wanted to be found. And when I stepped through the doorway with Luca's hand gentle but firm at my elbow, guiding me forward like I might bolt at any moment, which, to be fair, was not entirely outside the realm of possibility, I saw him standing behind a massive desk of dark wood that looked like it had been carved from a single tree, his back to me as he studied a wall of monitors that showed various camera feeds, and I didn't need to look closely to recognize the cafe where I'd been sitting just 20 minutes ago. "Thank you, Luca," Dante said without turning around, his voice carrying that same quiet authority I remembered from the gala, the kind of tone that didn't need to be raised to command absolute obedience. And I heard Luca retreat behind me, heard the soft click of the doors closing. And then it was just the two of us in this room full of books and expensive electronics, and the weight of everything we hadn't said to each other in 3 months. "You can leave us." He was wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with scars that told stories I probably didn't want to know. And his dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. And even from behind, even in this moment of absolute uncertainty and fear, I couldn't deny the way my body responded to his presence, the way something in me recognized him as the father of my child, in a way that went beyond rational understanding. Something primal and undeniable that had been there from the moment we first locked eyes across that ballroom. "Who was he?" Dante asked, his voice deceptively calm, still not turning to face me. And I watched his hand rest on the desk, fingers spread wide, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the controlled fury radiating from him like heat from a furnace. And I realized he was giving me a moment to compose myself, giving himself a moment to master whatever violence was churning beneath that careful surface. Because men like Dante Salvatore didn't lose control. They chose when and how to unleash it. "Just my ex-boyfriend," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous space of the study, echoing slightly off the high ceilings and the wall of windows that looked out over gardens bathed in afternoon sunlight. And I wrapped my arms around myself even though the room wasn't cold, needing something to hold on to, needing some kind of barrier between me and this conversation that I'd been avoiding for 3 months. "He's nobody important, Marcus Thornton. Just a guy I wasted 2 years of my life with before I caught him cheating and finally got the courage to leave." Dante turned then, and the full force of his dark eyes meeting mine felt like being struck by lightning. Like every molecule in my body suddenly remembered exactly how those eyes had looked down at me 3 months ago, when he'd been inside me. When I'd been gasping his name and clutching at his shoulders and pretending that this was just physical, just sex, just two people seeking comfort in each other's bodies without any complications or consequences. And the bitter irony of how wrong I'd been about that last part made me want to laugh, except nothing about this situation was actually funny. "Marcus Thornton," he repeated, and the way he said the name made it sound like a curse, like something distasteful. He was rolling around on his tongue before spitting it out, and he moved around the desk with that predatory grace that made it obvious why people feared him, why his name was whispered in certain circles with a mixture of respect and terror. The trust fund baby whose father owns Thornton Investments, who's never worked a real day in his life, who was engaged to Skylar Mitchell exactly 3 weeks after you left him. The fact that he knew all of this, that he'd clearly had Marcus investigated despite me never mentioning his name, despite us not speaking since that night, should have terrified me, should have sent every self-preservation instinct I possessed screaming into overdrive. But instead I felt something warm unfurl in my chest, something that recognized the protection implicit in that knowledge, in the fact that Dante had been keeping track of my life even from a distance, making sure he knew who I was dealing with, who might pose a threat to me or to the child I carried. "I didn't know you were watching me," I said, and it came out almost like an accusation, almost like I was angry about the invasion of privacy, even though part of me, the part that had been terrified and alone and trying to figure out how to raise a baby connected to the Mafia without any guidance, was grateful for it. Grateful that I hadn't been as abandoned as I'd thought, even if the surveillance felt invasive and controlling and exactly like the kind of thing a possessive mob boss would do. I thought after that night, after I never heard from you, that you'd just moved on, that I was just another... Another what? He interrupted, and suddenly he was much closer than he'd been a moment ago, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that brought back memories of tangled sheets and whispered words, and the feeling of being completely consumed by another person. Another meaningless hookup? Another woman I'd forget about by morning. His hand came up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything I knew about him, with everything I'd heard whispered about Dante Salvatore in the 3 months since I'd learned exactly who I'd slept with, exactly whose child I was carrying, and his thumb brushed across my cheekbone, wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen, and the tenderness of the gesture made my throat tight with emotions I didn't want to name. "I gave you space because I thought that's what you needed, because you looked at me the morning after like you'd made the worst mistake of your life, because I could see the panic in your eyes when you realized what you'd done, who you'd been with," he continued, and his voice had dropped lower, intimate and raw in a way I hadn't heard from him before, like he was letting me see beneath the armor he wore for the rest of the world. "But I never stopped watching, Vivian. I couldn't, not after that night. Not after I'd touched you and tasted you and felt you fall apart in my arms, and especially not after I noticed the changes, the way you started wearing looser clothes, the way you stopped drinking coffee at that cafe you love, the way you touched your stomach sometimes when you thought no one was looking." The realization that he'd known about the pregnancy, that he'd figured it out possibly before I'd even confirmed it myself, sent a shock through my system that made my knees weak, and I might have stumbled if his other hand hadn't come to rest on my hip, steadying me, holding me up, and I stared at him with wide eyes, trying to process the implications of what he was saying, trying to understand what it meant that he'd known and hadn't said anything, hadn't approached me, hadn't demanded answers or made claims or done any of the things I'd been terrified he might do. "You knew," I whispered, and it wasn't a question but a statement, an acknowledgement of just how thoroughly I'd underestimated this man, how completely I'd misunderstood the situation I was in, and his slight smile held no humor, only a kind of grim satisfaction at having his suspicions confirmed. "How long have you known?" "I suspected the moment you started avoiding your favorite wine bar, confirmed it when you switched from regular coffee to decaf, and started taking prenatal vitamins that my people photographed you buying at 3 different pharmacies as if spreading out your purchases would somehow keep it secret," he said, and there was something almost like amusement in his voice now, though it was edged with steel. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice, Vivian? Did you think I'd sleep with you once and then forget you existed?" "I thought you'd be angry," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, and I felt my hand move to cover my stomach again, that protective gesture that had become second nature. "I thought you'd think I was trying to trap you, or that you'd want me to. I didn't know what you'd want, Dante, and I was scared, and I just needed time to figure out what I was going to do, how I was going to handle this, and I know I should have told you. I know I should have reached out, but I didn't know how to tell the most dangerous man in the city that I was pregnant with his child." Something flickered across his face at that. Something that might have been pain or anger, or some combination of both, and his grip on my hip tightened just slightly. Not enough to hurt, but enough to remind me that he was capable of it, that the gentleness he was showing me was a choice rather than his nature. "The most dangerous man in the city," he repeated, and his jaw clenched, and I could see him working to control whatever emotion my words had sparked. "Is that what you think of me? Is that all you think I am?" "I don't know what you are," I said honestly, because lying to Dante Salvatore seemed both pointless and potentially fatal, and I might be many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. I know what people say about you. I know what the news reports when someone connected to your organization ends up dead or missing. I know that you're powerful and dangerous, and that getting involved with you was probably the most reckless thing I've ever done. But I also know that you were kind to me that night, that you made me feel safe when I was broken. And I don't know how to reconcile those two versions of you, the monster everyone warns about, and the man who held me like I was something precious. You are something precious, he said, and the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. And before I could process them, before I could figure out how to respond, his hand slid from my hip to rest over my stomach, his palm warm and large, and covering the small bump that had been my secret for so long. You're carrying my child, Vivian, my blood, my legacy, my heir. And that makes you untouchable, do you understand? It also makes you mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have made me angry. Should have made me push him away and assert my independence and remind him that I wasn't property to be claimed. But instead I felt that same traitorous warmth spreading through me. That same recognition of safety in being claimed by someone powerful enough to protect me from everything, including men like Marcus, who thought they could humiliate me without consequence. I'm not yours, I said. But my voice lacked conviction, and we both knew it. And the slight smile that curved his lips told me he'd heard the lie in my words as clearly as if I'd shouted it. I'm not anyone's, Dante. I'm my own person. And yes, I'm carrying your child, but that doesn't give you ownership of me. Doesn't it? He asked, and his thumb was moving in slow circles over my stomach now. And I wondered if he could feel the baby, if he could sense the life we'd created growing beneath his hand. Tell me, Vivian, when you lay awake at night thinking about the future, about raising this child, do you really imagine doing it alone? Do you see yourself trying to protect our son or daughter from the world without me, without my resources, without my name shielding them from the kind of people who would use an innocent child to get to me? The picture he was painting terrified me, because it was exactly what I'd been worried about in the dark hours of the night, when the baby's movements woke me, and I lay there wondering what kind of world I was bringing this child into, what kind of danger they'd be born into simply by virtue of being Dante Salvatore's offspring. And hearing him articulate those fears made them real in a way they hadn't been when they were just my private anxieties. I didn't ask for this, I said, and my voice broke on the words, and suddenly all the emotions I'd been holding back for 3 months came flooding out, and I was crying in earnest now, not the careful tears I'd fought back in the cafe, but real ugly sobs that shook my whole body. I didn't ask to fall into bed with you. I didn't ask to get pregnant. I didn't ask for my ex-boyfriend to humiliate me in public, or for you to have me followed, or for any of this, and I'm trying, Dante, I'm trying so hard to figure out how to be strong enough for this baby. But I don't know if I am. I don't know if I'm capable of being the mother that a child connected to your world needs to be. He pulled me against his chest then, and I went without resistance, too tired and overwhelmed to maintain the distance I'd been trying to keep. And his arms came around me with a certainty that made me feel like, maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry this weight alone anymore. And I buried my face against his shirt and let myself break down in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since I'd first seen those 2 pink lines. You don't have to be strong alone, he murmured against my hair, and one hand came up to stroke down my back in long, soothing motions that reminded me of that night 3 months ago when he'd held me after, when we'd laid together in his bed, and he'd traced patterns on my skin, and I'd felt safer than I had in years. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Vivian. You don't have to do this by yourself. You were never going to have to do this by yourself, because from the moment I suspected you were carrying my child, you became the most protected woman in this city, whether you knew it or not. You can't just decide that, I said against his chest. But the protest was weak, and we both knew it. And I felt his chest rumble with what might have been a laugh. I already did, he said simply, and there was finality in his voice that told me arguing was pointless. I've assigned a full security detail to you starting today. I have a property in mind where you'll be safer than your current apartment. And I've made it very clear to everyone in my organization that you are under my personal protection, and anyone who so much as looks at you wrong will answer to me directly. The scope of what he was describing, the complete restructuring of my life that he'd apparently already set in motion without consulting me, should have made me furious, should have made me demand my autonomy and my right to make my own choices. But instead, I found myself asking the question that had been haunting me since Luca had opened that car door outside the cafe. "What are you going to do about Marcus?" I asked, pulling back just enough to look up at his face, to see the expression that crossed his features when I mentioned the man who'd humiliated me, and what I saw there made my blood run cold and hot at the same time, made me understand exactly why people feared Dante Salvatore. "What I should have done the moment I learned he'd made you cry," Dante said, and his voice was soft but filled with a promise of violence that was all the more terrifying for its quietness. "Marcus Thornton made a mistake today, Vivian. He touched something that belongs to me. He caused you pain. He disrespected the mother of my child in a public place. And in my world, those are offenses that carry consequences." "Dante," I started, but he pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me gently but firmly. "I won't kill him, if that's what you're worried about," he said, and there was dark amusement in his eyes now, as if he could read my thoughts, as if he knew exactly what I was imagining. "Not unless you want me to, which I suspect you don't, despite how satisfying it might be. But I will make sure he understands that you are off limits, that speaking to you, looking at you, thinking about you are all privileges he no longer has, and I will do it in a way that leaves no doubt in his mind about what will happen if he ever crosses that line again." The protective fury in his voice, the absolute certainty with which he spoke about defending me, should have frightened me, should have made me recognize the danger of being claimed by a man who settled disputes with violence and intimidation. But instead I felt something in my chest loosen, some knot of fear and isolation that had been pulled tight since the moment I discovered I was pregnant, and I realized that as terrifying as Dante Salvatore might be to the rest of the world, he was offering me something I desperately needed: safety, protection, and the promise that I wouldn't have to face this impossible situation alone. "I need time," I said, because even though part of me wanted to surrender to the security he was offering, wanted to let him sweep in and solve all my problems with his power and resources and absolute certainty, I knew that making that choice meant stepping fully into his world, meant accepting that my child would grow up surrounded by danger and violence and moral complexity that I wasn't sure I could navigate. "I need time to think about all of this, to process what you're saying, to figure out what's best for the baby." "You can have time," Dante said, but his hand was still on my stomach, still claiming his child with that possessive touch, and his eyes were still dark with promises and threats, and something that looked dangerously close to the emotion I'd been trying not to name. "But while you're thinking, you'll do it from somewhere safe, somewhere I can make sure nothing happens to you or our child, and you'll let my people protect you, because Marcus Thornton may be harmless, but there are others out there who aren't, people who would see you as a weakness to exploit, and I won't risk that. I won't risk you." Before I could respond, before I could agree or argue or demand more autonomy than he was offering, his phone buzzed on the desk, and I saw his jaw tighten as he glanced at the screen, and something dangerous flickered across his face, something that made me instinctively step back from the sudden shift in his energy. "What is it?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice because whatever message he'd just received had transformed him from the almost gentle man who'd been holding me into something cold and lethal. "It seems," Dante said, his voice like ice over steel, "that your ex-boyfriend is even more stupid than I gave him credit for. According to my sources, Marcus Thornton just walked into a police station to file a harassment complaint against me, claiming I threatened him, and he's brought Skylar with him as a witness, which means he's just escalated this from a personal insult to a very public problem that I'm going to have to handle much more carefully than I'd planned." The revelation that Marcus had actually been stupid enough to walk into a police station and accuse Dante Salvatore of threatening him hung in the air between us like a bomb that hadn't quite finished detonating. And I watched Dante's expression shift from the almost tender protectiveness he'd been showing me to something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of mercy. And I realized with startling clarity that I was about to witness exactly how a man like him handled threats to his carefully constructed empire, how he dealt with people who were foolish enough to challenge him in ways that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug with money or quiet intimidation. "I need to make some calls," Dante said, already moving back toward his desk with that purposeful stride that suggested he was already 3 steps ahead in whatever plan was forming in his mind. And I watched him pick up his phone and begin typing with swift, decisive movements that spoke of a man accustomed to crisis management, accustomed to putting out fires before they could spread beyond his control. "Luca will show you to one of the guest suites where you can rest. You've had a stressful day, and I don't want you worrying about this, Vivian, because I promise you that I will handle Marcus Thornton in a way that leaves no lasting damage to either of us." The casual way he dismissed me, the assumption that I would simply retreat to some gilded cage while he dealt with the mess that my ex-boyfriend had created, sparked something rebellious and stubborn in my chest. And I found myself standing my ground even as every instinct screamed at me to do exactly what he suggested, to let him handle this situation that was spinning rapidly beyond anything I knew how to manage. Because watching Dante work was like watching a master craftsman, and I was just a civilian stumbling through a world where the rules I'd always lived by simply didn't apply. "No," I said, and the word came out stronger than I'd expected. Strong enough that Dante actually paused in his typing to look up at me with an expression that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by someone he'd just claimed as his. And I saw his eyebrow raise in a gesture that managed to be both questioning and slightly threatening. "I'm not going to hide in a guest suite while you clean up a mess that I'm partially responsible for. Marcus wouldn't have filed that complaint if you hadn't scared him, and you wouldn't have scared him if he hadn't humiliated me. So whether you like it or not, I'm involved in this situation, and I deserve to know how you're planning to handle it." For a long moment, Dante just studied me with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd ever constructed, and I could see him weighing my words, calculating whether my involvement would be an asset or a liability, whether my presence during whatever came next would help or hinder his ability to control the situation. And I held my breath waiting for his response, half expecting him to simply order Luca to remove me from the study regardless of my protests, to exercise the kind of absolute authority that men in his position were accustomed to wielding without question. "You want to see how I work?" he asked finally, and there was something almost like approval in his voice, mixed with warning, as if he was giving me one last chance to back down, to choose the comfortable ignorance of not knowing exactly what methods he employed to protect his interests. "You want to understand what it means to be connected to me, to see the reality of the world you're bringing our child into?" "Yes," I said, even though my heart was pounding and my hands were trembling slightly, and every self-preservation instinct I possessed was screaming at me to take the escape route he was offering, because I knew that once I saw behind this particular curtain, once I witnessed firsthand how Dante Salvatore neutralized threats and managed problems, I wouldn't be able to pretend anymore that he was anything other than exactly what everyone said he was. And whatever illusions I'd been holding on to about the man who'd held me so tenderly 3 months ago would shatter against the hard reality of who he actually was in his professional life. Dante's smile was sharp and dangerous, and held more than a little satisfaction, as if I'd just passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking, and he gestured to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. An invitation and a command rolled into one, and I moved to sit down with as much dignity as I could muster, settling into the butter-soft leather while he pulled his own chair around so that he was facing me rather than sitting behind the desk, closing some of the distance between us, while still maintaining the air of control that seemed to emanate from him, like heat from a fire. "The first thing you need to understand," Dante said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed posture that belied the sharp intelligence in his eyes, is that Marcus Thornton just made himself a problem that extends beyond the personal insult he delivered to you this afternoon, because by walking into a police station and making accusations against me, he's drawn official attention to our organization at a time when we've been working very carefully to maintain a certain level of legitimacy in our business dealings, and that kind of scrutiny is exactly what we've spent the last 5 years and considerable resources trying to avoid. He pulled out his phone again, and I watched as he placed it on the desk between us and pulled up what appeared to be a live feed from security cameras, and with growing horror I recognized the interior of the police station, where Marcus had apparently gone to make his complaint. Could see him sitting in what looked like an interview room with Skylar beside him, both of them looking simultaneously nervous and self-righteous, as if they genuinely believed they were doing something noble by reporting Dante to the authorities. "My attorney is already en route to the station," Dante continued, and even as he spoke I saw a notification appear on his phone, a text message confirming what he'd just said, and I marveled at how quickly his organization had mobilized, how seamlessly his people had sprung into action without him even needing to give explicit orders. Marcus will discover very quickly that filing a false police report against a respected businessman, because that's what I am on paper, Vivian, a legitimate entrepreneur with interests in real estate and import-export and several very profitable restaurants, carries its own set of legal consequences. And by the time my lawyers are finished explaining the definitions of defamation and harassment and filing frivolous complaints, he's going to wish he'd just kept his mouth shut and moved on with his life. But he's not wrong, I said quietly, because even though I appreciated Dante's protection, even though some dark part of me was satisfied that Marcus was finally facing consequences for his casual cruelty, I couldn't pretend that Marcus's accusation was entirely fabricated. "You did threaten him, or at least you were planning to. You said yourself that you were going to make sure he understood I was off limits." "I said I was going to make sure he understood there were consequences for disrespecting you," Dante corrected, and his voice held no hint of apology or shame, only the kind of certainty that came from absolute confidence in his own moral framework. But I hadn't actually done anything yet, which means Marcus is claiming I threatened him based on paranoia or guilt, or possibly just stupidity, and without any evidence of an actual threat. No witnesses, no recordings, no physical confrontation. His complaint is worthless, especially when my very expensive legal team starts asking him why he would possibly think that a legitimate businessman would care enough about his ex-girlfriend to threaten him over a comment made in a cafe. The logic was sound in a twisted sort of way, and I could see how someone like Dante, who'd spent years learning how to operate in the gray areas of the law, would know exactly how to turn Marcus's complaint against him. How to make my ex-boyfriend look like either a liar or a fool while simultaneously positioning himself as the victim of false accusations, and watching him work through the strategy with that calm, methodical approach was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "What about Skylar?" I asked, because I could see her on the camera feed, sitting beside Marcus with her phone out, probably texting her friends about the drama they were involved in, probably thinking this would make a great story to tell at parties about how her fiancé stood up to a dangerous criminal. "She's with him. She'll back up whatever he says." "Skylar Mitchell," Dante said, and something in his voice made me look up sharply, because there was a note of satisfaction there that suggested he knew something I didn't, had already considered and solved this particular problem before I'd even thought to raise it. "Whose father is currently being investigated by the SEC for insider trading, whose family's wealth is built on a foundation that's considerably less stable than it appears, who has everything to lose if someone with connections and resources decided to make sure that investigation receives the kind of attention that might lead to actual charges rather than just a quiet settlement." The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and dark, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I understood what he was suggesting, how he was planning to neutralize Skylar's testimony before she ever had a chance to give it. And this was the moment, I realized, where I had to decide whether I could live with the methods Dante employed to protect what was his, Whether I could accept that being connected to him meant benefiting from the same ruthless efficiency that destroyed people who got in his way. You would destroy her father's life to stop her from backing up Marcus's story? I asked. And I couldn't keep the shock entirely out of my voice. Couldn't quite reconcile this cold calculation with the man who'd held me so gently just minutes ago, who'd touched my stomach with such reverence and promised to protect our child. I would do whatever necessary to protect you and our baby from the consequences of Marcus Thornton's stupidity, Dante said, and he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to my eye level, making sure I could see the absolute sincerity in his expression. But I won't need to destroy anyone's life, Vivian, because the mere suggestion that I could, the simple reminder that the Mitchell family has vulnerabilities that could be exploited, will be enough to ensure that Skylar suddenly remembers that she didn't actually hear me threaten Marcus, that she was too far away or too distracted or simply mistaken about what she thought she witnessed. Even as he spoke, his phone buzzed again, and I watched him glance at it, watched a small smile curve his lips, and he turned the screen so I could see the message that had just arrived. A simple confirmation from someone named Romano that the Mitchell situation is being handled. And I wondered what that meant exactly. What methods were being employed at this very moment to ensure Skylar's cooperation. Whether someone was making a phone call or paying a visit, or simply letting it be known through the right channels that continuing to support Marcus's complaint would be extremely unwise for everyone involved. "This is what you do," I said slowly, trying to process the speed and efficiency with which Dante had mobilized his resources, the way he'd identified and neutralized threats before they could fully materialize. "This is how you've stayed in power for so long, isn't it? Not through violence or intimidation primarily, but through information and leverage and knowing exactly where everyone's pressure points are." "Violence is messy and draws attention," Dante agreed, and there was something almost like pleasure in his voice, as if he was enjoying showing me this side of himself, as if my understanding of his methods was somehow intimately satisfying to him. "It's a tool I use when necessary, but it's rarely the most effective option. People respond much better to the threat of losing what they value than they do to physical harm. And the beauty of having the kind of resources and connections I've cultivated is that there's almost always something people value that can be leveraged to ensure their cooperation." I thought about Marcus, sitting in that interview room thinking he was doing something brave and righteous, having no idea that even as he gave his statement to whatever detective was assigned to his case, Dante's people were already pulling apart the threads of his complaint, already identifying every weakness in his story, already preparing the legal and social consequences that would rain down on him the moment he walked out of that police station. And I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and guilt, because part of me wanted him to suffer for humiliating me. But another part recognized that what Dante was orchestrating went far beyond simple revenge and into territory that might permanently damage Marcus's life. "What will happen to him?" I asked, and Dante must have heard something in my voice, some hint of the internal conflict I was experiencing, because his expression softened slightly, and he reached out to take my hand, his thumb moving over my knuckles in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting, but felt more possessive than soothing. "Nothing permanent," he assured me, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed him, wasn't entirely sure that his definition of permanent matched mine. "By tomorrow morning, Marcus will discover that his complaint has been dismissed due to lack of evidence, that he's been strongly encouraged not to pursue the matter further, and that there may be some minor legal consequences for filing what the police determine was a frivolous report made out of spite or attention-seeking. Nothing that will ruin his life. Nothing that will follow him forever. Just enough discomfort and embarrassment to ensure he thinks twice before he ever speaks about you or me or this situation again." "And if he doesn't take the hint?" I asked, because I knew Marcus, knew his pride and his tendency to double down when he felt challenged, knew that being told to back off might make him more determined rather than less. "Then we move to more permanent solutions," Dante said simply, and the casual way he said it as if we were discussing weather or dinner plans rather than potentially destroying someone's life, sent a chill down my spine even as part of me recognized the pragmatism in his approach. But I don't think it will come to that, Vivian. Marcus Thornton is many things, but he's not actually stupid enough to keep pushing once he understands the real consequences of his actions. And my people are very good at making sure people understand exactly what they're risking when they cross certain lines. His phone buzzed yet again, and this time, when he looked at the message, his smile was sharper, more satisfied, and he showed me the screen where I could see security camera footage from what appeared to be a very upscale restaurant. And with a jolt, I recognized Marcus's father, sitting at a table with two men in expensive suits. And even though I couldn't hear what was being said, I could see the tension in the elder Thornton's posture, could see the way his face had gone pale, and I understood that Dante's reach extended far beyond just Marcus himself, that he was applying pressure at every level of the Thornton family's life to ensure compliance. "That's Marcus's father," I said unnecessarily, because of course Dante knew who he was looking at. Of course, this was all part of whatever intricate plan he'd put into motion within minutes of learning about Marcus's complaint. "What are those men telling him?" "They're explaining that his son has made some very poor choices today, and that as his father, and as someone who has business interests that could be affected by association with someone who makes false accusations against respected members of the business community, he might want to have a conversation with Marcus about withdrawing his complaint and apologizing for wasting police resources," Dante explained. And I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, could see the way he was enjoying this chess match, where he'd already positioned all his pieces for checkmate before his opponent even realized the game had started. They're also mentioning that Thornton Investments has been looking to expand into some very lucrative real estate opportunities in the waterfront district, and that those opportunities might suddenly become available or unavailable, depending on how this situation resolves itself. The elegant brutality of it took my breath away. The way Dante had identified exactly what Marcus's father would care about most, his business reputation and his financial interests, and was using those pressure points to ensure that the entire Thornton family united in shutting down Marcus's complaint before it could gain any traction. And I realized that this was how empires were built and maintained, not through constant violence, but through strategic application of leverage at exactly the right moments, through understanding human nature well enough to know that most people would choose their own interests over principle when the stakes were made clear enough. "He'll make Marcus withdraw the complaint," I said. And it wasn't a question because I could already see how this would play out. Could imagine the phone call Marcus would receive from his father, the pressure that would be applied, the way his righteous anger would crumble under the weight of family expectations and financial realities. "Within the hour," Dante confirmed, and he glanced at his watch as if he was timing it, as if he knew exactly how long it would take for all the pieces to fall into place. "And then Marcus will call Skylar and tell her they made a mistake, that he overreacted, that he doesn't want to pursue this anymore, and she'll be relieved because by then someone will have had a very uncomfortable conversation with her father about his SEC troubles and how they might escalate if his daughter continues to involve herself in situations that don't concern her." I sat back in my chair, my hand unconsciously moving to my stomach again, and I thought about the child growing inside me who would be born into this world of calculated moves and strategic pressure and power wielded so efficiently that most people never even saw it coming. And I wondered what kind of person you had to become to navigate this life successfully. Whether my child would grow up thinking this was normal. Whether I would be able to teach them any kind of moral framework that made sense in a world where the rules were so different from everything I'd been raised to believe. "You're thinking too hard," Dante said gently, and I realized he'd been watching me process all of this, had been studying my reactions with the same careful attention he probably applied to everything in his life. "You're wondering if you can live with this, if you can accept that this is how I solve problems, if you want our child raised in a world where power and leverage matter more than justice or fairness." "Yes," I admitted. Because there was no point in lying to him. No point in pretending that I wasn't having serious doubts about whether I was equipped to be part of his world. Whether I could maintain any sense of my own moral compass while benefiting from methods that made me deeply uncomfortable even as I recognized their effectiveness. "Let me tell you something about justice and fairness," Dante said, and he moved from his chair to kneel in front of me, bringing himself to eye level, his hands resting on my knees in a gesture that was intimate and grounding at the same time. "Marcus humiliated you today because he thought he could, because in his world, there are no real consequences for being cruel to people who can't fight back. Because men like him have been taught that they can do whatever they want as long as they maintain plausible deniability and social respectability. And where's the justice in that, Vivian? Where's the fairness in a system that protects people like him while leaving people like you vulnerable to their casual cruelty?" His words hit somewhere deep in my chest, resonating with years of watching people like Marcus glide through life on privilege and charm, while people who actually worked hard and played by the rules struggled. And I couldn't deny that there was something satisfying about seeing that balance shift, about knowing that for once, someone like Marcus would face actual consequences for his actions, even if those consequences were delivered through methods that existed outside the official justice system. "I'm not saying my way is better," Dante continued, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I'm saying my way is what's available to us, what keeps you and our child safe in a world that isn't fair, and isn't just, and doesn't protect the people who deserve protection. I'm offering you the security of knowing that no one will ever humiliate you, or threaten you, or make you feel small again without answering to me. And yes, that comes with moral complications and ethical gray areas. But it also comes with the absolute certainty that you are valued and protected and cherished in ways that Marcus Thornton never valued or protected or cherished you." Before I could respond, before I could sort through the tangle of emotions his words had created, his phone rang with an actual call rather than a text, and he answered it without taking his eyes off me, listening for just a moment before a slow smile spread across his face. "Marcus Thornton just called the police station and asked to speak to the detective handling his case," he said, and I could hear the triumph in his voice even as he kept his tone professionally neutral. "He's withdrawing his complaint and apologizing for wasting their time, citing stress and a misunderstanding, and Skylar Mitchell has confirmed that she doesn't actually have any evidence of threats or harassment, that she may have misinterpreted a situation she wasn't fully aware of. It's over, Vivian, exactly as I said it would be." The speed with which everything had been resolved, the efficiency with which Dante had dismantled Marcus's attempt to cause problems, should have reassured me, should have made me feel safe and protected and grateful for his intervention. But instead I felt something else. Something that might have been fear, or might have been awe, or might have been the dawning realization that I had fundamentally underestimated the man whose child I was carrying, had thought I understood the scope of his power, when I'd actually only seen the smallest fraction of what he was capable of when properly motivated. "What happens now?" I asked, and my voice sounded small even to my own ears. And Dante's expression softened as he reached up to cup my face again, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in that gentle gesture that seemed at odds with everything I'd just witnessed. "Now," he said, "Marcus Thornton goes home and has a very uncomfortable conversation with his father about making better choices, and Skylar goes home and has a very uncomfortable conversation with her father about the same thing. And you come upstairs with me and let me feed you dinner and show you the suite I've had prepared for you, and we start figuring out what our life together is going to look like. Because make no mistake, Vivienne, after today, after you chose to stay and watch how I work instead of taking the escape I offered you, you've made your choice about whether you can live in my world." "I haven't decided anything," I protested. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Knew that by sitting here and watching him orchestrate Marcus's downfall, by feeling that surge of satisfaction when his complaint was withdrawn, by accepting Dante's protection even knowing the methods he employed to provide it, I had already crossed a line that I couldn't uncross, had already committed myself to this path in ways that went beyond just carrying his child. "Haven't you?" Dante asked, and he stood, pulling me up with him. And before I could answer, before I could try to maintain some pretense of independence or resistance, he was kissing me with the kind of possessive intensity that made my knees weak and my resolve crumble. And I was kissing him back, because despite everything I'd seen, despite all the moral complications and ethical concerns, I couldn't deny the pull between us. Couldn't pretend that some part of me hadn't been waiting for exactly this moment since the night we'd first been together. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard, and his hand had found its way back to my stomach. That now familiar gesture of claiming both me and the child I carried, and I saw something in his eyes that looked dangerously close to the emotion I'd been trying not to name, something that made my heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. "There's something else you need to know," Dante said, and the sudden shift in his tone, the way his expression had gone from satisfied to concerned in the space of a heartbeat, made my stomach clench with renewed anxiety. "While my people were investigating Marcus's movements today, they discovered something troubling. After he left the police station, before his father's call, he made a phone call of his own, to a number that our intelligence has connected to the Costa family, my primary rivals in this city. And while we couldn't hear what was said, the fact that he's reaching out to my enemies suggests that Marcus is even more foolish and more dangerous than I gave him credit for, because now he's not just a petty ex-boyfriend nursing wounded pride, but a potential security threat who knows you're pregnant with my child, and might be desperate enough to share that information with people who would absolutely use it against me." The revelation that Marcus had contacted the Costa family hung in the air between us like a guillotine blade suspended by a fraying thread, and I felt all the warmth and desire from Dante's kiss evaporate in an instant, replaced by ice-cold terror that flooded through my veins and made my hand fly protectively to my stomach, covering the small bump that had suddenly transformed from a secret I was keeping to a target that my ex-boyfriend might have just painted on both me and my unborn child. And I watched Dante's expression shift from concerned to something far more dangerous, something that reminded me that the tender lover who'd held me 3 months ago was also a man capable of extreme violence when the people he cared about were threatened. "How much does he know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, because the implications of Marcus reaching out to Dante's enemies were spinning through my mind in increasingly terrifying scenarios, each one worse than the last. And I thought about how casually I'd touched my stomach in that cafe, how obvious my pregnancy might have been to someone who was looking for it, how Marcus had called me fat in front of Skylar, which meant she knew too. And now, there were potentially multiple people who could connect the dots between me and Dante and this baby that represented both a blessing and a massive vulnerability. Could he have figured out about the baby? About you being the father? "I don't know yet," Dante admitted, and the fact that he was being honest with me instead of offering false reassurances somehow made everything more frightening, because it meant he was taking this threat seriously enough that he couldn't afford to sugarcoat the reality of our situation. "My people are working on getting a recording of the call, pulling in favors with contacts who have access to the Costa organization's communications. But even if Marcus only told them that his ex-girlfriend is connected to me somehow, that would be enough to make you a person of interest to them. Enough to put you in danger because the Costas have been looking for any weakness they can exploit for years, and a pregnant woman with ties to me would be exactly the kind of leverage they'd kill to possess." The casual way he said "kill," as if it was just another word instead of a description of what might actually happen to me if the wrong people discovered my connection to him, made my knees weak, and I might have collapsed if Dante hadn't immediately stepped closer, his arm coming around my waist to steady me, and I could feel the tension radiating from his body, could sense that beneath his controlled exterior, he was absolutely furious, not at me but at the situation Marcus had created, at the vulnerability my ex-boyfriend had exposed through his stupidity and vindictiveness. "I need to move you somewhere more secure," Dante said, and he was already pulling out his phone again, already typing instructions to what I assumed was his security team, and I watched him work with that same efficient intensity I'd witnessed earlier, except now that intensity was focused on protecting me rather than punishing Marcus. The estate is safe for now, but if the Costas know or even suspect that you're carrying my child, they'll be watching, looking for patterns, trying to figure out where you are and how they can get to you, and I can't risk keeping you somewhere predictable while we assess the full scope of what Marcus may have told them." "Where will you take me?" I asked, because the idea of being uprooted from my life, from my job at the hospital and my apartment and everything familiar, was terrifying in its own way, but not nearly as terrifying as the alternative of staying put and making myself an easy target for people who apparently wouldn't hesitate to hurt a pregnant woman if it served their purposes. And I realized with crystalline clarity that this was the reality I'd signed up for when I'd slept with Dante Salvatore. That the danger I'd been abstractly worried about had suddenly become concrete and immediate, and directed specifically at me and my unborn child. I have a property upstate, completely off the books, purchased through shell corporations that can't be traced back to me, staffed by people whose loyalty is absolute, and who have protected members of my family before," Dante explained. And even as he spoke, I could see him thinking 3 steps ahead, planning not just for my immediate safety, but for every contingency, every possible scenario, where the Costas might try to find me or use me against him. "You'll be comfortable there, Vivian, I promise you that. It's not a prison, it's a sanctuary, and you'll have everything you need, including medical care from a doctor I trust completely, someone who's delivered babies for other women in situations where discretion was paramount." The fact that he'd apparently had to arrange secret medical care for pregnant women before should have alarmed me, should have made me question exactly what kind of organization I was becoming entangled with. But instead, I found myself focusing on the practical reality that at least he had experience with this type of situation, that I wasn't the first woman connected to his world who'd needed protection during a pregnancy. And somehow that made me feel slightly less alone in this terrifying new reality I was navigating. "What about Marcus?" I asked, because even though my primary concern was obviously my own safety and the safety of my baby, I couldn't help but wonder what Dante was planning to do about my ex-boyfriend, who had apparently escalated from being a minor annoyance to being an actual security threat. "If he's already contacted the Costas, if he's already given them information or even just raised their suspicions about me, then convincing him to withdraw his police complaint doesn't really solve the problem, does it?" "No," Dante agreed, and his expression had gone cold in a way that made my blood run icy in my veins. "It doesn't. Which is why Marcus Thornton has just graduated from being a nuisance I was planning to handle with minimal force to being a legitimate threat that requires a much more permanent solution. Because the moment he decided to involve my enemies in our personal business, he stopped being your pathetic ex-boyfriend and became a security risk that I cannot afford to leave unaddressed." The implication of what he was saying settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable, and I knew I should protest, should insist that there had to be another way to handle this that didn't involve violence or worse. But the words stuck in my throat because part of me, the part that had been humiliated in that cafe, the part that was terrified for my baby's safety, the part that was finally understanding exactly how dangerous this world could be, wanted Marcus to face real consequences for his actions, wanted him to understand that his petty revenge had put innocent lives at risk, wanted him to pay for creating a situation where I now had to go into hiding to protect my unborn child. "I need you to trust me," Dante said, and he took my face in both his hands, forcing me to look directly into his eyes, to see the absolute sincerity there mixed with that dangerous promise of protection at any cost. "I need you to trust that everything I do from this moment forward is to keep you and our baby safe. That I'm not acting out of anger or revenge, but out of necessity, because in my world, Vivian, hesitation gets people killed, and I will not hesitate when it comes to protecting what's mine. I will not show mercy to people who threaten my family, and I need to know that you can accept that you can live with the choices I'm going to have to make to ensure that both of you survive this." I stood there in his study, with his hands framing my face and his eyes burning into mine, and I thought about the life growing inside me, about the tiny person who deserved to be born into a world where they were safe and loved and protected, And I thought about Marcus reaching out to dangerous people without understanding or caring about the consequences his actions might have for anyone but himself. And I thought about Dante offering me the kind of absolute protection that most people only read about in books. The kind that came with a price, but also with the certainty that someone powerful enough to enforce it was willing to pay that price without hesitation. Do what you have to do, I heard myself say. And the words felt like they were coming from someone else, from some harder version of myself that had been forged in the crucible of the last few hours. And I saw something flash in Dante's eyes. Approval, satisfaction, possessive pride. And I knew that I'd just crossed another line, had just given him permission to handle Marcus in whatever way he deemed necessary, had just accepted that being part of his world meant making impossible choices and living with their consequences. Just promise me that when this is over, when Marcus is no longer a threat, and the Costas don't know where to find me, you'll tell me the truth about what happened, about what you did to keep us safe. I promise, Dante said. And then he was kissing me again. And this time it felt different. Felt like a claiming and a vow and a recognition that we were bound together now, not just by the child I carried, but by the choices we were making, by the moral lines we were crossing together, by the understanding that we were building something that existed outside the normal rules of society, something dangerous and powerful and utterly consuming. When he pulled back, he kept one hand on my face while the other moved to rest over my stomach, and I could see the fierce protectiveness in his expression, could see that whatever happened next, he meant every word about keeping us safe. Pack whatever you can't live without, he said softly. We leave in an hour. 6 months had passed since that terrifying afternoon when Dante had whisked me away to his upstate sanctuary. 6 months of living in a beautiful prison where every window had bulletproof glass and every guard knew my face. 6 months of watching my belly swell with new life. While somewhere in the city below, Dante had orchestrated the kind of chess match that ended with Marcus Thornton disappearing from my life so completely that it was as if he'd never existed at all. And now I stood in the nursery of Dante's main estate, the one I'd been brought back to just 2 weeks ago, when he'd finally deemed it safe enough for me to return to civilization, holding our daughter Isabella against my chest, while afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that I now knew were reinforced with technology that cost more than most people's houses. And I marveled at how completely my life had transformed, how the woman who'd sat crying in that cafe was someone I could barely recognize anymore. Isabella made a small sound against my shoulder, that particular whimper that meant she was about to wake up from her nap, and I shifted her carefully, supporting her impossibly tiny head with hands that had become skilled at this over the past 2 weeks since she'd entered the world in a private birthing suite with Dante holding my hand and whispering promises in Italian that I didn't understand but felt in my bones. And as her dark eyes, so much like her father's, fluttered open and focused on my face with that unfocused newborn intensity, I felt the same overwhelming surge of fierce protective love that had consumed me the moment the doctor had placed her in my arms, still covered in vernix, and screaming her fury at being thrust into the cold world. She has your mouth, Dante said from the doorway, and I turned to find him leaning against the frame with that relaxed posture that I'd learned meant he was neither relaxed nor casual, but rather completely alert and aware of everything happening in his domain. And he was looking at Isabella and me with an expression that still sometimes caught me off guard. Something soft and vulnerable that he showed to almost no one else. Something that transformed the dangerous man everyone feared into someone capable of the kind of devotion that poets wrote about, and most people never experienced. She has your stubborn chin, I countered, and he moved into the room with that predatory grace that had never stopped making my pulse quicken, and he came to stand beside me, one arm wrapping around my waist while his free hand came up to stroke Isabella's cheek, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from fingers that I knew had pulled triggers and signed death warrants and done things I'd specifically asked him not to tell me about in detail. I have something to show you, Dante said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made my stomach clench with apprehension, because I'd learned to read his tones over the past 6 months, had learned to distinguish between business Dante and Father Dante, and the version of himself that he showed me when we were alone, and he let his guard down enough to admit that having a family terrified him almost as much as it completed him. Something I promised I would tell you when the time was right, when you were ready to know the full truth about what happened to Marcus Thornton, and how I ensured that he would never threaten you or Isabella again. I looked down at our daughter, at the innocent life we'd created who deserved to grow up safe and protected, even if that protection came at a cost that most people would find morally unconscionable. And I thought about all the conversations Dante and I had over those 6 months in hiding, all the late-night discussions about what kind of parents we wanted to be, and what values we could possibly teach a child who would grow up knowing that her father's power came from operating in the shadows. And I'd come to understand that there were no easy answers, no clean solutions, only the constant navigation of impossible choices, and the hope that love would be enough to balance out all the darkness. "Tell me," I said, because I'd meant it when I'd asked him to be honest with me, when I'd insisted that I needed to know what he'd done in my name and in Isabella's name, even if that knowledge would change how I saw him, even if it would complicate the already complicated love I developed for this man who'd turned my life upside down and then reconstructed it into something I'd never imagined but couldn't imagine living without. Dante took Isabella from my arms with the practiced ease he'd developed over the past 2 weeks, cradling her against his chest in a way that made my heart ache with how natural it looked, and he carried her to the rocking chair by the window, settling into it with our daughter tucked securely in the crook of his arm, and I followed, perching on the ottoman in front of them, and I waited while he gathered his thoughts, while he decided how much truth I could handle, and how much he needed to share. "Marcus Thornton is alive," Dante began, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight, some knot of guilt and complicity that had been sitting there since the day I'd told him to do what was necessary. He's alive, but he's no longer the person he was. I gave him a choice, Vivian. The same choice I gave you in my study that day, the choice to see the reality of the world he'd stumbled into and decide whether he could live with the consequences of his actions or whether he needed to be removed from the equation entirely. "What kind of choice?" I asked, watching Isabella's tiny fingers curl around Dante's much larger one, watching this man, who commanded an empire with ruthless efficiency, transform into someone utterly gentle with our child. And I thought about choices and consequences, and the infinite gradations between good and evil that I'd been forced to acknowledge over the past months. I showed him exactly what the Costa family would have done to you and Isabella if they'd gotten hold of the information he was planning to sell them. I showed him photographs and case files and evidence of what happens to pregnant women who get caught in the crossfire of mob wars. And I watched him realize that his petty need for revenge had almost resulted in your death and the death of his unborn child, Dante said. And his voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of rage that still lived there, the fury at how close Marcus had come to destroying everything. And then I gave him 2 options. He could disappear, completely and permanently, relocate to a city where neither I nor the Costas would ever find him, start over with a new identity, and the understanding that if he ever contacted anyone from his old life, he would be killed immediately. Or he could stay and face the consequences of betraying someone under my protection, which would have been considerably less pleasant and considerably more final. He chose to disappear, I said. And it wasn't a question because of course he had. Because Marcus had always been a coward beneath his bravado, had always chosen self-preservation over principle, and I felt a complicated mixture of relief that he was alive and satisfaction that his entire life had been dismantled, that he'd lost everything, his fiancée, his family, his identity, as payment for what he'd almost done to me and Isabella. He's in Montana now, working as a ranch hand under a name I picked out for him, living in a trailer and doing manual labor for the first time in his privileged life. And every month he receives a reminder that I'm still watching, That I still have the power to end his new existence if he steps out of line, Dante confirmed, and he looked down at Isabella, whose eyes had drifted closed again, content in her father's arms. And Skylar never knew about any of it. As far as she's concerned, Marcus had some kind of breakdown after withdrawing his police complaint and ran off to find himself. And her father was so relieved that his SEC troubles mysteriously disappeared around the same time that he didn't ask too many questions about where his daughter's fiancé had gone. I sat there absorbing this information, processing the reality that Dante had found a solution that satisfied his need for justice, while avoiding the kind of violence that I wasn't sure I could have lived with, and I understood that this was his gift to me. His acknowledgement that even though he operated in a world where death was often the simplest answer, he'd chosen a more complicated path because he knew it mattered to me, because he was trying to be the kind of man who could balance the darkness of his profession with the light of the family we were building together. "Thank you," I said quietly, and I saw him understand that I wasn't just thanking him for sparing Marcus's life, but for trusting me with the truth, for keeping his promise, for showing me that even in his world there could be mercy and restraint and choices that honored both safety and humanity. "I would burn the world down for you," Dante said, and his free hand reached out to cut my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in that gesture that had become so familiar, so cherished. "I would destroy anyone who threatened you or Isabella without hesitation, without remorse, but I also know that you need to be able to look at me and see someone worth loving, someone who can be both the monster that protects you and the man who holds our daughter with gentle hands. And I'm trying, Vivian. I'm trying every day to be worthy of the family you've given me." I leaned forward and kissed him, pouring 6 months of complicated emotions into it. All the fear and relief and love and acceptance that had been building since that afternoon in the cafe when my old life had ended and this strange new existence had begun. And when I pulled back, I saw tears in his eyes. This man, who'd probably never cried in front of another living soul. And I knew that we'd changed each other in fundamental ways, that I'd softened some of his harder edges while he'd taught me that strength sometimes meant accepting protection, that independence didn't have to mean facing everything alone. "We saved each other," I whispered, echoing words he'd said to me in the hospital after Isabella was born, when I'd been exhausted and overwhelmed and he'd climbed into the bed beside me and held us both. And I watched him smile, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Yes," he agreed, looking down at Isabella, who slept peacefully between us. This tiny, perfect being who represented both the most dangerous vulnerability we could have and the most profound joy either of us had ever experienced. From a life of darkness without light. I reached out to stroke Isabella's soft, dark hair, and I thought about how I'd arrived at this moment. All the impossible choices and moral compromises and terrifying revelations that had led me here. And I knew that I would make the same choices again, would walk the same path, would accept the same complications because the alternative, a life without Dante, without Isabella, without this fierce, protective love that surrounded us like armor, was unthinkable now. And as the three of us sat there in that sunlit nursery in a house protected by men with guns and security systems that cost fortunes, I finally understood what Dante had been trying to tell me from the beginning. That sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. That family can be forged in darkness and still shine with its own light. And that love, real love, isn't about perfection or purity, but about choosing each other again and again, despite all the reasons why you shouldn't. Building something beautiful and unbreakable from all the broken pieces of who you used to be.